Okay. Dr. Jennifer Webb, how wonderful to be live with you and to see you again, even though we've only known each other in the 0101 for so many years at this point, it feels like. But welcome to the Week's Well. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure and a privilege to be here.
Well, I likewise feel the same. And as you know, you and I have gotten to know each other since early COVID. We first met through the research webinar that you joined Sapir Khalsa and me to do, which was around the misrepresentation of yoga in the media and research you've done around that. And from meeting you there, you and I became more personal, professional friends through work that, or, sort of content that I was so happy for you to do for the Week's Well community. And then, fast forwarding to now, we've unsuccessfully, but we're not done yet, sort of applying for grants and talking about various ways that we can collaborate and I can, in my work, support yours, because your journey's been so interesting. It's a long one and an interesting one. And even in the last year, you've become a yoga teacher, right? Or 18 months has it been?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes.
Yeah. So there's just so many pieces that I'd love for the audience to hear about, not least of which is your deciding in the last, couple of years to become a yoga teacher in COVID, taking an online course through Integral Yoga, close to my heart, since it was my first training as well. But let's start from the beginning of your academic career and how it, sort of narrowed toward or careened toward or expanded toward the study and research of yoga and its impact in society.
Yes. Wow. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. Oh my goodness. So when I think about sort of the short, long view, I really credit a good friend when we were just trying to survive, our graduate training. It was a very wonderful time at USC in Los Angeles. And, at that time, now this is now over 20 years ago, I look back and recognize what a privileged space I was in, that yoga was alive and well. It was almost like, they have like a Trader Joe's in every corner, like a yoga studio. Yoga access was very high in Los Angeles while we were also trying to navigate the rigors of our graduate training. So I really credit my really good friend to sort of introduce me to the practice. And that had always been sort of more of like my own kind of bubble, this was sort of my own space to restore and to be able to continue to do what mattered. Then as I continued my training in clinical psychology, really focused on how different kinds of stressors like racism, other kinds of intersectional stressors were really taking a toll on members of diverse groups. That sort of stayed with me. As I then graduated and moved into a postdoc position at Duke Integrative Medicine, I was very, very fortunate to work with Dr. Ruth Quillian-Woliver, as well as others. And as part of her team, we were working on some NIH-funded grants. At the time, the institute that funded the research was called NCAM. Now it's called NCCIH. And we were primarily looking at how mindfulness-based approaches in the context of eating could be supportive for folks who were wanting to either lose weight or manage weight and or regulate certain metabolic indicators. And so I really credit that time with continuing to kind of keep alive this centering of mindfulness and mind-body practices, which again, with Duke Integrative Medicine, mindfulness was at the center of the wheel of health. So that again was something that pervaded across different disciplines and providers' backgrounds for folks that were affiliated with Duke Integrative Medicine. So again, very, very grateful for that training. Then as I shifted into my faculty position at UNC Charlotte, and this is going to be the start of my 17th year, which is amazing. I can't even thinking like, oh my gosh.
Congratulations, that's wonderful.
Thank you. And during my kind of first, 6-7 years there, I was strongly identified as an obesity researcher, very much a mind-body researcher. So that's been a continued theme. And I was, really motivated and still am with trying to see how our research could be of use to supporting the health and well-being of folks from diverse backgrounds. And particularly, it had been sort of when I was particularly starting, Black and African American women who had been and continue to be sort of the face of folks who are living in larger bodies. However, at that time, when I first started, I was much more focused on weight being the problem and weight loss being the answer in a more of a panacea way. However, it took kind of reconnecting actually with yoga in the form of a lot of pioneers, probably like around 2014 or so, were really coming onto the scene with recognizing that we need to sort of expand our understanding of living in our bodies, and how yoga can be a practice that can help people live in their bodies as well as they can, regardless of what their bodies look like, size, color, ability. And so it was very transformative for me personally, as well as through the directions that our research lab went in. So we kind of let go of weight loss, weight management needing to be the main thing. And we're really shifting into more of this positive embodiment, health at every size sort of framework. And again, yoga then sort of took on even more of a centrality. So it wasn't just like a personal practice for me. It was, wow, now we can kind of expand the tools that we'd already been looking at in terms of meditation, self-compassion, through the practice of yoga as a potential vehicle to help improve the well-being of folks from a lot of different backgrounds who may not have thought that yoga is something that is of interest to them or something they could do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so let's talk about the 2014 piece
Yeah.
before we go back to mindfulness being the center of that wheel. I want to get back to that, but let's talk a little bit about that 2014 moment and these people that influenced you and you potentially influenced and what you've been doing with those people since.
Yes. Oh, goodness. I would say that one of the most instrumental volumes that our research team, so again, I'm very, very fortunate to have a lot of student interest, both in terms of graduate students, undergraduate, postdoc students. And at the time, I tend to, well, actually, this is not anything that was just happening then, but I tend to try to structure our lab meetings as, in part, like a book club meeting. So in addition to talking about research that's relevant to our research goals, we also tend to read and discuss a book that's often, but not exclusively, written by a non-psychologist to give us that broader perspective. So at that time, among the books that really sort of brought things together for me was a volume called Yoga and Body Image that was co-edited by Anna Guest-Jelly and Melanie Klein. Anna Guest-Jelly, who you and others may know, is the founder of Curvy Yoga, and Melanie Klein is the founder of the Yoga and Body Image Coalition. And so they really brought together amazing stories of other pioneers' experiences with how yoga was really transformative for them and being able to live better with who they are authentically. So that book was very, very instrumental in sort of starting to really shift sort of the focus of our lab. So much so that we were able to partner with Anna Guest-Jelly in one of our first sort of small-scale pilot RCTs really involved exposing young women at UNC Charlotte who were living in larger bodies that, again, technically body mass index of 25 or greater. But again, body mass index is something that I've also let go of as needing to be an important metric. It's very problematic in a lot of different ways. But at that time, that was 2016, 2017, that we were shifting into, well, let's sort of expose folks who maybe haven't gotten exposed to yoga in ways that could be more accessible. And so we were able to have these participants they were all young women at UNC Charlotte to be able to have exposed to curvy yoga practices, 3 different practices, 15 minutes each. That was the other piece. We wanted to sort of see if the amount of time of the practice could really matter as it relates to kind of folks kind of dipping their toe in to what all this could look like.
Right.
And we're just so grateful. Some of the findings were published recently, and it was very encouraging, some of the gains that folks were able to experience, both in terms of what they shared qualitatively about their experience, as well as sort of looking at some of the mean differences over time in terms of measures of positive body image, for example, improved over time within that particular project. So very, very grateful.
I wonder, I'd love to geek out for a minute for the audience around what you mentioned about this RCT, this randomized controlled trial, and to describe what I think I heard you say. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the sort of infrastructure, the design of the study and what made it an RCT. And because the more an audience like this one who is, in the thousands, listening as a means to filter what they learn back into the world, like the more that they also are trying to link up with you or people like you to conduct or create or invent or be teachers for trials like this, the better, in my opinion. But you also said, so that's sort of the quantitative side, but you also said there were some qualitative aspects to the study. So can we just sort of take a minute to tease out what those, it was 3 15-minute groups, within the control group was doing what, or if you could maybe just break it all down for us.
Oh, yes, please. I appreciate this. And I appreciate the opportunity to try to break things down kind of outside of my bubble of academia.
We love it. Yeah, we love it. I know it's a challenge, but see, it's interfaces like this is where I really think the magic happens, where a civilian like me has to listen to such an educated person like you and understand, okay, so how does that impact me and where can I go try to make change on your behalf, basically? So.
Oh, goodness. And again, education goes multiple ways. I continue to learn and grow. So I definitely. So with we called it Yoga at Every Size project. And so this was a small scale randomized control trial. And RCT is a study design that really tries to help isolate what might be the active ingredients that could be helping to explain these hopefully positive effects of your intervention. And so it's often viewed as a gold standard relative to some other designs, which are still really meaningful, yet the strength of the conclusions you can make about them are a little bit more diverse. So the RCT is often viewed as the gold standard of saying sort of, because we saw these changes occurring in this group who was randomly assigned to this intervention, and we didn't see these changes, or at least the same level of change or shift in those that maybe didn't get exposed to this particular intervention, we can relatively safely say that the intervention was probably contributing to those effects. So again, there's also some obviously downsides to RCTs too. And looking back, to tell you the truth, I actually have become much more of a proponent as NCCIH, the NIH Institute that funds a lot of this yoga research and mind-body research. They really have developed this program of developing research and intervention research. And so even though this was a pilot RCT, we included open-ended questions so that we got a chance to hear from the participants also about what they liked. What were some things that were hard? What helped? What were barriers? What would be things that they would love to see maybe change in their future iteration of the program? And so because we included some of that, in addition to some other quantitative metrics of acceptability, it really is not only an RCT, it was really also feasibility, acceptability trial, kind of melded into one. Now, if I did it over again, I probably would have parsed those out a little bit more. But again, that's something that shows that I also, as a researcher, have also learned over time that even though funders had historically been trying to fund these large-scale RCTs, that some of them really have taken a step back and said, you know what, before we give you millions of dollars to do these like multi-site RCTs, you have to let us know, is this really acceptable? Is to the population you want to work with? Is it really feasible to actually collect the data in the way you want to? So I'm sorry, I went off on a little bit of a tangent.
No, it's interesting.
but to kind of give you a little bit of an idea that
Yeah.
that this particular project was a little bit of a hybrid. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
RCT, and we had mixed methods to also help flesh out more of that acceptability piece, which is so important.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the actual components of the project, we had folks randomized to two conditions. So one was being exposed to 3 15-minute curvy yoga videos. They were on YouTube, which they were made via YouTube. And then the control condition was a wait list. So after the intervention was over, we actually emailed them the links to the video so that they could also partake on their own. So that was our version of a control. So again, there could be many different kinds of control groups. We had a wait list. And so half the participants went through exposure to the curvy yoga intervention. And each of the 15-minute videos was taught by Anna Guest-Jelly. For those who might not be familiar with her, she's also lived in a larger body. And the intervention was getting exposed to one of those videos per week. So that was the first 3 weeks. And then in the 4th week, we made all 3 of those videos accessible so that the participants could actually then choose which of the videos they wanted to partake in. Maybe all, maybe one, maybe 2. And so that was the other piece that we wanted to try to see, was not only the brevity of the practice, but also the brevity of the intervention. So this was only a 4-week trial, 28 days. And so in addition to getting exposed to the yoga videos, we also invited them to jot down every day just like a sentence or two about something they were grateful for that day that their body enabled them to do. So really about body functionality, appreciating the functionality of their body in a values consistent manner. And then another component was we actually created a wristband. And and it's sort of interesting because I know that part of it was my bias. I tend to, wear wristbands and things like that. And sometimes I took a step back and realized, you know what? I realized that others also have little reminders about things that matter to them, and they wear them in terms of bracelets and wristbands and things like that. So what happens if we maybe have this as part of the intervention? So we actually had a custom wristband made for participants in the intervention as another tool to hopefully remind them that yoga is for everybody. It's not meant to just be for folks that look a certain way or whose bodies function a certain way.
Right, right. So a question, so what I'd love to do is link in the show notes to the curvy body, curvy yoga YouTubes, because I'm assuming they're still out there, right?
Oh, actually, that's a really good point. This was an agreement that Anna Guest-Jelly made with us just for her, just based on the study. And I'm not sure if they're accessible anymore
that's
to
fine.
the wider audience.
Basically, what I'm in, because this audience is multidisciplinary, so there's people practicing Kundalini and people practicing outside of the United States and people practicing Iyengar and people practicing integral yoga. The actual physical form of the yoga takes a really different tenor depending on what the lineage is, which is of course, kind of the heart and soul of this project, while also as boldly as possible trying to explore the intersection of yoga and science, the scientific research on yoga, which is why I love this conversation in so many ways. So I guess that, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just so curious what the poses were. Could you explain what the 15 minutes looked like? Each was different, or just a summary of what the practice was?
Yes, and I also will direct folks, if you'd like, I can also make available, it's open access, the actual journal article, which gives even more detail about the specific poses, both in terms of the Sanskrit and
that'd be great.
English version of the poses. And so each of the practices was really sort of targeting this idea of living well in your body. There was a mixture of like sun salutation, partial sun salutations, for example. There was also some reference to sort of loving kindness, sort of mantra, to sort of tether that to the breath as well as in part to some of the poses as well. So it was, the reason why I actually selected some of those were specifically because of the integration of also compassion sort of focus principles aligned with the breath and with moving in the body, which, based on some of the feedback from participants, it was really impactful for them to really not only experience the poses and also to sort of, have these mantras that were very affirming to them.
I'm so glad you said it that way, and I'm actually really glad I asked, because one of the things I don't take for granted, even after all these years of such different kinds of yoga that I've studied and become certified in or whatever, because I'm about to go into my 22nd year of teaching yoga, and the thing,
a lot of wisdom.
well, such as it is, right? I mean, it's one of the most amazing teachings in wisdom teachings really is, as soon as you think you know anything, you realize there's, first of all, so much more that you need to know or can know or could know, but also that you just, what is knowledge really? I'm not sure what it is actually. And so I guess the thing I don't take for granted is the meaning and the impact of the poses themselves, and how it seems to me that as we have conflated the word yoga with some kind of unsightly, unseemly things in social media, like very scantily clad, very thin, probably like eating ED type women who are so often able-bodied, they're white, they're young. I was just last week, just this morning, editing the conversation that I'm sort of releasing tomorrow with James Fox of the Prison Yoga Project. And he was saying that lots of people really think that when he tells them he's teaching yoga at San Quentin prison, they're like, why would you teach yoga to those guys? Like, what in yoga would be good for them? Because we had a moment in the conversation because it was really upsetting to hear. But that's because he and I and you, and probably most people on this call, understand the depth of the practice, and that it goes so much beyond anything able-bodied, first of all. Second of all, if you're just moving the body in these random shapes, extending the arm from the trunk or lifting it over your head or folding forward or stepping your foot back, or, that is not yoga. That's actually just movement. But mindful movement and mindful awareness that then is tethered to the breath and tethered to, as you described, this mantra of gratitude, I think necessarily lifts up the thing that is easy to, if I may, bypass or pass over in our community when we're thinking about describing it to the outside world, to telling people, yoga is not movement, actually. It's mindful awareness, it's conscious breathing, it's deep relaxation, and it is conscious, mindful movement, sort of threading through those other three things. And that's yoga. So I guess I appreciate you saying those things, because I find it very interesting that you made that connection between the movement and compassion, the movement and even gratitude. And so were you able to capture scientifically or from a research place those mood states or mind states? Did you get into that? Like what, gratitude mood state is versus, depressive mood state or anxious mood state or disassociation? I know I'm not educated in this realm, so I know I'm probably like stitching together different disciplines, but how did you make those connections between just the stepping your foot back and these mood states, if you will?
Yes. Oh, goodness. Wow. What a rich question. We, at this sort of stage of the research, it wasn't at the level where we could really parse out those very specific kinds of positive emotional states in relation to that being kind of one of the key ingredients that was driving sort of change. That would definitely be really important if we had a larger scale trial where we had maybe more than those two conditions, and that we maybe were able to capture what we call more state level change. So there's researchers who have developed measures of not only emotion, like positive, negative emotion, but also variables like mindfulness and mindful awareness that's unfolding in, for example, the course of a meditation practice, the course of a yoga class. And so if we had the opportunity to perhaps sort of redo this and to measure the participants' experience sort of before and after an actual yoga session, I think that would give us a lot more data to be able to further clarify some of those changes at that level of analysis.
Yeah, it's where my mind goes, because the more this conversation is really reminding me of the work that Eddie Stern is in, like himself doing now, and moving on to do research that he really wants to do also with Sapir. Sapir just keeps, so he's like the sort of fairy godfather of this podcast. We always mention, so many of us are always mentioning it, but he was talking about, it's at the very end of our conversation, and I'll put it in the show notes, where he's talking about whether or not, how to account for the fact that yoga itself as a practice is really difficult to measure discretely, because it has such wide-reaching impact in the body. So, I was just thinking yesterday, after I just told you before I clicked record, I've now got this, part-time job that's out in the world, and I'm going to an office building, and, I'm kind of like wearing heels again and stuff. And so when I came home yesterday to teach, I just did this deep, rich yoga practice. And it just, every time it feels new. But in this particular case, after the ergonomic challenges, in my opinion, of the entire sort of work office world, the chairs and the computers and the clicking and the leaning forward, all the things, it's just, it scrunches the body. So as I was doing my practice, I just thought, my God, the profundity of the feeling of releasing the hamstrings, and the joy, I don't know how to say it, of just exhaling deeply from my abdomen in a quiet way. I mean, even just these little micro moments span so many different parts of me. I mean, they affect my brain, they affect my heart, they affect not just my hamstrings, And so how do you measure that? So I guess that then leads me to the question, which still is kind of heading me back. I want to head us back toward the mindfulness at the center of that wheel. What do you think are the challenges that researchers face, that you feel like you face, even as you've multiple times in this conversation talked about, if I could do it again, or, where is your research going, and what challenges do you think you all are facing in the scientific and social research realm around describing yoga as like the intervention for everyone?
Goodness, yes. Wow. That's such an important question. And, in addition to, in terms of measurement, as you're talking about this very holistic experience of yoga and how to kind of try to parse it out and compartmentalize it. So I think you're really highlighting, as others have as well, that it is very tricky just to try to rely on sort of one particular metric, right? At the same time, it's sort of like wanting to try to capture, for example, maybe some of the other physiological changes that are happening, like heart rate variability, other kinds of maybe hormonal or neurotransmitter, changes that are happening. So trying to get sort of this sort of multimodal profile. And I know some researchers have been starting to look at that. And I'm always sort of curious also, what are some of those trade-offs, given that some of the ways that you're trying to actually assess these particular metrics could be maybe taking you out of the actual experience. So I think that's what's also such a tricky part of this.
Oh, that's such interesting. I never thought about that. You're right. Of course. Whew.
Yes, indeed. So I think that again, that's I think just so fascinating though that I applaud those who are looking at biomarkers or looking at those that are assessing things like for example even like Apple Watches, all the
I've been
different
thinking about
data,
that. Hmm.
yes, and Fitbit and all the different data that is possible now in consumer versions of some of these products. It really does open up some wonderful opportunities, and also trying to figure out, what are we still measuring yoga, right? Are we still measuring, mindfulness? It's such a wonderful sort of, like you're saying, sort of philosophically and scientifically, kind of that intersection.
Hmm. And so where, if you could cite, and this may not be possible, the sort of top three things that in yoga that you think can be measured for the greater good, to, well, I know it's not your realm to predict necessarily how people are going to respond to it. Maybe I can do that, but like, what are the top three, four things that you see really can be measured? So I'm just thinking, what are these top three things that you think we could measure in yoga?
Yes. And one of the things was really stimulated by something you just shared not that long ago when you were asking about what actually were some of the poses or what actually comprised sort of the curvy yoga intervention. And this has really been an important area that has a lot of implications to try to demystify when folks are actually having yoga research being
Right.
conducted, to really try to say, okay, what are the actual poses? What was the sequence? So again, the audience, regardless of their background, at least can sort of see, okay, this is what was actually happening. This is what was taught, or at least what was intended, right? Sort of depending on whether or not the
Mm-hmm.
participants actually engaged with the practice. Yet this is at least what was the intended content to be taught. So that's at least one thing that we can continue to strive for, is being able to measure and be clear about what actually was the ingredients of the yoga intervention. And there's been a lot of movement in that direction to try to be more transparent.
That's great.
Exactly. I would probably say self-report is still really important as it relates to getting more of the individual's perspective as to sort of what is unfolding within them. And again, I have become an even more strong proponent of the value of mixed methods. So trying to use qualitative inquiry in particular to do a deeper dive. And that might be another complementary methodology to trying to understand the whole person as a system. That's also engaging in this system, this systemic practice, systemically focused practice. And so it is self-report, and self-report is still important. And so maybe qualitative inquiry could be continued to be, prioritized as another methodological tool.
So I have a question about that too, because, when you and I were working together briefly, but still importantly, impactfully, it felt to me, on submitting an idea for this grant we were working on, I loved, as we have also discussed a couple times, the conversations in the open Q&A, or the sort of open information session that we attended, around the accountability in scientific research for diverse populations, and whether or not the scientific method itself is an inclusive and therefore intelligent approach. So I wonder what your thoughts are going forward about how we, this movement in academia more largely, but in scientific research, I think specifically, and in social research, obviously, on how we're measuring, what questions we're asking to actually measure, what's valid, what's not valid. What are your thoughts on that?
Wow, that can be like a whole other.
I know. I have a very bad habit
podcast.
in these
Maybe you can have a panel.
I know. I do this. at the
Oh,
end of my
goodness.
conversations, I'm like, can we do part 2? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe just a few
Oh,
minutes
no.
and we'll put a pin in it for next time.
No, I'm just so grateful though, and I also just recognize I'm just one person, one researcher. Yet this has been also a kind of a growth area for me, to sort of recognize, like you're saying, how even the systems of how we conduct research are not culture free, right? They're not culturally neutral. And so I think that's been so enlightening for myself to be reflexive about those, that sort of education. And again, recognizing that the way that certain kind of more traditional, and I put that in air quotes, ways of trying to determine what is valid, what is knowledge, is certainly imbued with a lot of different, particularly isms. And so there have been some really
Biases, right?
fascinating, and thought-provoking developments in sort of the realm. It's called kind of sort of anti-racist approaches to conducting research, but it definitely is not exclusive to race, but really thinking more broadly about intersectional experiences,
Totally.
identities. And so some of the things that folks are encouraging, like you're saying, is sort of more mixed methods, qualitative methods being prioritized, making sure that there is efforts of engaging members of the community that you're hoping to actually benefit at all stages of the research process. Also, even how we disseminate. So again, having the opportunity to have this conversation with you to talk about our research, it's like, oh, yay, it's going to be, I'm very grateful for, being able to be published in academic journals, don't get me wrong, and also recognizing that that only goes so far. So
Right.
that's among the other, sort of movements, is to try to disseminate findings in more accessible outlets, and not just relying on sort of the more traditional academic outlets as sort of the only way to disseminate. Also open access. So as part of the open science movement, which is also dovetails, I think, with a lot of this anti-racist movement as well, there is sort of, there are efforts to, for example, making, your actual data accessible to other researchers, to publish in journals that provide open access, which means that folks don't have to have like subscriptions through universities to be able to read the research.
Yeah.
So these are all really important components that are happening.
It's an interesting, idea or connection just around literacy,
Mm,
period. And I'm just going to make this really strange connection. So forgive me. I can't, but I can't help myself. One of the things that James Fox, the head of the Prison Yoga Project, which is international, which I, of course, knew in sort of the ambient part of my brain, but then researching it, you're like he's in Europe, they are in Europe, they are in Australia, they are all over the United States, all over, California. And he's been teaching at San Quentin for 40 years, 3 times a week for 1 year. Each year. So in other words, the program he teaches, these men, a group of men, they engage in this yoga practice that he teaches, all of the things that you and I are talking about, the multimodal, benefits of yoga, all four, prongs of the yoga that we love to, sort of quote Sapir as having popularized in our small but hopefully mighty world of the four kinds of yoga. There's the mindful movement, there's the conscious breath, there's the mindful awareness or meditation, and deep relaxation. And so he's doing all four of those things to help teach these men over time, learn down regulation, self-regulation, self-love,
mm,
restorative work around harm caused not just
yeah,
to others but to yourself. I mean, it
yes.
just goes on and on. And
Trauma,
he talks about emotional literacy, the
yes.
literacy of the emotional body that yoga teaches. And
Mm,
that's just what has kept him going for now over 40 years in this particular project, Prison Yoga Project. So then I think about literacy itself and how until the printing press, there was only literacy for super rich people all over the world who were just sharing their brilliant thoughts with each other, while slaves worked on their behalf to keep their homes cool and their, water running and their, toilets clean and whatever. And now here we have the scientific revolution, the information revolution, which has changed obviously the world forever, forever and ever and ever. I can remember being, like traveling like in all over the place early in the aughts and like late 90s and observing internet cafes and being like, dang. And also just knowing that, mobile phones have been in the developing world's hands much earlier than they were even in the developed world's hands, like a sort of comparable socioeconomic status. But now we're all rolling around with like the world in our hands, all the information we could possibly find. So scientific literacy is such an interesting idea because that's the very bedrock of what has been in this next phase of evolution, information that has sort of been hoarded or been, kind of kept protected in these sort of academic, environments, which creates this have and have not sort of community. So the qualitative research to me really squares with everything that I've been observing and learning and trying to be a part of since the awakening of 2020 that so many of us had, and many of us belatedly, of course, because the qualitative research and qualitative, like I feel, I am seen, I am experiencing, begins to elevate a truth, a data point that was never previously validated. Was it, or was it in scientific research?
Oh, well, for sure. So I definitely don't want to dismiss the long and rich history of qualitative methods. I think that this has just been a wonderful time to further kind of amplify. And also maybe just to increase the awareness for folks who, again, are outside of certain contexts. So that I think is so important. It's so important.
Maybe
scientific literacy is so important. And I think even more so in today's age of misinformation and how to try to distill, what's on social media. Is it from a credible source? What is your metric of what credibility is? So that even is something that, I try to integrate even within my coursework as a faculty member to our students, both at undergraduate and doctoral levels, of trying to help sort of decipher, because it's not easy at all.
Yeah, and it also brings me back to your presentation with Satbir and me, because at the same time, what you did so brilliantly was put the faces of these women whose names you wanted to test in the 500-person audience or whatever it was, if they knew their names. And as we remember, not many people did know most of these women's names, and you wanted us to know their names and to say their names. And so social media, on the other hand, is giving, thank goodness, the channel and the avenue for these names to be known and seen for the good work that they're doing. So it's kind of an interesting time where we're making way for, and I guess maybe what I'm trying to say, trying to say it not as succinctly as I wanted to, is that prior to, let's just say, for example, that conversation where you showed, and I'm sure lots of people were there at this conversation, but for the audience, Jennifer showed pictures of 5, if I recall, African-American yoga teachers. Among them, I think Anna was one of them. She had to have been, and probably Melanie. No?
Well, actually, I don't believe that they identify as Black or African-American.
They don't?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So will you tell me, sorry, tell me who you showed then. I don't remember the names, it seems.
Yes, and this might be also on me. I can probably think of it since it's been a couple of years, but Jessamine
this part out of the conversation.
Jessamine Stanley was probably high on the list.
Jessamine, of course.
Dana Smith was probably high on the list.
And again, we got this part, because I don't want to take it down too far down the rabbit hole, but I would just basically that moment of showing us names and bodies of work that the audience, the mostly white audience, had never seen before,
Mm,
changed their perception of what a yoga teacher is and looks like,
yes,
what he, she, or they is doing in the world.
that's right.
And that's the thing, I think that media, that
Yes,
medium of Zoom and the webinar, as an extension of all of these images we see in social media elsewhere all the time, are
yes,
also changing for people.
exactly. In positive ways. So that's
In
why it's such a powerful vehicle. It really is.
Yeah, it all is. It's just how to be good stewards of it and how to care. And that leads me then maybe to the last question, which was one of my first, which was this really interesting thing you said, and that seems to be driving the kind of heart and source of your work, which is the word mindfulness at the center of the wheel of
Mm,
this work you were doing. So I guess I'd love to hear a little bit about, you were you were a yoga practitioner at that time and had an appreciation for how it was helping you personally, but it
yeah.
sounds like the mindfulness piece was the thing that caught you first as this kind of common denominator of these
Hmm.
alternative, well, sorry, not alternative, I think just well, it's been adjunctive. I mean, there's been different adjectives of
Yeah.
these different interventions through NCCIH. So can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that, just how that was a moment for you?
Yes. And I think, again, I was very fortunate. Again, it's interesting taking the perspective of being sort of helping folks who are going to be, clinical health psychologists, in the doctoral program. When I can remember when I was in their shoes now over 20 years ago, I really credit also a sort of part of this journey was one of my former faculty members, because he was really on the cutting edge of exposing us to interventions that integrated mindfulness, like dialectical behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. So, that in conjunction with my personal yoga practice, and then my postdoctoral experience at Duke Integrative Medicine really were kind of the trifecta. Um, I think, like you're talking about, sort of this resurgence during COVID, as difficult as it has been for so many of us, that I really was so grateful for the blessing of the time to be able to receive training through Integral Yoga Institute. And it was their first ever BIPOC only, but BIPOC centered training. So all the trainers identified as BIPOC, as well as all of those of us who were learning in all parts of the world. So it was such a privilege to be part of that. And then afterwards, I also pursued training in prenatal. And so that combined was really sort of inspired by wanting to try to help shift in some way, some small way, just the horrendous perinatal uh, health outcomes for BIPOC folks during pregnancy and the postpartum. And so that really was sort of things sort of coming together during the pandemic for me, personally and professionally, has really kind of helped to continue to sort of steer that, being another important sort of component of our sort of advocacy, research advocacy program. Yeah.
That's so great. I'm going to find this citation that Sapir, in fact, I'll just link people as well to the yoga and pregnancy video that he and I did together. It's like, as I call them the yoga infomercials, because it's like, why should I do yoga if I'm in this population? And he's like, well, let me tell you. And we,
Yes.
produced, it was so great, just like 6 minutes or whatever it was. But there's one study of pregnant women whose some biomarkers are measured before, I think it's salivary cortisol
Mm,
levels. I think that was just the thing measured, but before and after the yoga class, like, goes way down. And what an just what a simple study that shows, women going in pregnant feeling X and then leaving after the class and feeling Y, and seeing the clear line, the thing that occurred between the first measurement and the second measurement. So I think I want to stay there for just a second and say, I'll put that information in, but is there any, you're so, you're doing so many things. I just love how much you're producing. And so where do you think you're going to go with this prenatal thing? I've seen this, of course, in your signature, but didn't know exactly what was going on for it. So tell us a little bit about that before we wrap up,
well,
so
for
we can
sure.
follow your work there too.
Well, it takes a village. So again, it really is not just me who's
Yeah.
doing this. And so I'm very, very grateful for all of my collaborators and partners, professionals and students as well in this journey. I am actually in the process of collaborating with some folks. I know that you have met Chelsea Roth of Eat
Yes, I
Food
wanted to,
Thrive.
yeah.
Yes. And also, I'm not sure if you've ever met Dr. Catherine Cook-Catone, who's at SUNY Buffalo.
Yeah,
Yes. And
she's
so
great.
oh, yes. So I'm very grateful. And then my prenatal yoga teacher trainer, Lara Cohn Thompson, who's based in New York City, we are sort of among a group who's trying to pull a grant application together to hopefully be able to adapt the Eat, Breathe, Thrive curriculum that Chelsea developed for BIPOC and economically diverse folks during pregnancy for folks here in Charlotte. So we're very hopeful, but that is definitely an area that we wanted to kind of go into, particularly from the eating and embodiment side of things. And so given that Eat, Breathe, Thrive, is been around for 10 years, really well-established program. Chelsea's amazing. And it ties so much also into some of the work that we've also been trying to help recognize, just the value of yoga professionals being on the front line as partners and allies in promoting health for folks who could be struggling with body image and eating. So we're hoping that we'll get a chance to adapt the program and benefit some folks during this really high risk period for not really experiencing one's body maybe as well as one could, for a lot of different reasons, a lot of reasons that BIPOC folks, likely are not necessarily always experiencing their bodies the best during pregnancy and the postpartum. And eating has not necessarily been centered as much within BIPOC communities in general, but also for folks during the peripartum. And so we're really trying to sort of put more of a spotlight on that, on negative body image, eating concerns, a lot of, I can keep going on and on, a lot of challenges as it relates to even well-meaning Institute of Medicine guidelines about weight gain during pregnancy can be experienced as very oppressive. So we're trying to start kind of diving into that. So that's at least one area that we're hoping to further contribute to.
That is incredible. It's just incredible. I'm so glad to learn about that. I mean, you think I would have picked up on that in some of our offline conversations, but I did not know. And I'm glad that I'm learning it live alongside the audience. I hope that I can continue working with you and we can continue supporting what you're doing, because the thing that I see you do is you keep plugging yoga into these incredibly productive places for communities that really can, on the most basic level, learn about its multimodal benefits, not just for the body, but for these emotional states, for this emotional literacy we were talking about, but in all these other ways as well, the compassion, self-love, and even now into communities who will be, bringing another life into the, to me, that it strikes me as even epigenetic work, but
Yes.
how to change the mind state and change, the body that you're carrying. So it's
so
amazing.
exciting.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. We'll have all this stuff in the show notes, and I definitely hope we get to have a part 2.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.